Welcome to A New Prescription, where we explore modern healthcare, cutting-edge medical research and technology, and the complexities of healthcare politics. Join us as we provide insights and solutions to help you navigate the American healthcare system.
Hey everybody, this is Dr. Leonard Zwelling. It's another episode of A New Prescription. This is one I've been looking forward to for a long time. We have with us Dr. Cameron McIntyre, who is a professor of bioengineering and neurosurgery at Duke University. And my wife and I had the pleasure of hearing Dr. McIntyre present at a meeting at the Medical Alumni Council back in May about deep brain stimulation, something I knew absolutely nothing about. And it was quite remarkable. And we had to have him on the podcast. So we do. Today's our day. Here's Dr. McIntyre. And the obvious thing I think that we want to start with is, what is deep brain stimulation? How does it work?
Well, that's a lot to unpack there, but thanks for having me, and I'm really excited to have a chance to talk with you. So, deep brain stimulation is a general tool that is used to treat neurological disorders and psychiatric disorders. So it's a technology that's been around for, going on, 3 decades of, kind of consistent clinical use, but is relatively small in scale. Maybe 10,000 to 20,000 patients a year might, worldwide, might get this therapy. And so it's usually used to treat what we would call late stage neurological disorders that have no other, kind of therapeutic recourse. And so, the primary use case is for the treatment of advanced Parkinson's disease. But it also has utility in a wide range of other disorders like epilepsy, tremor, obsessive compulsive disorder, and then there are experimental uses of the technology in the treatment of depression and a variety of other things. So there's a big umbrella, but relatively small scale, I would say.
So we want to get to all those things, but first off, how does it go? How do you go about doing it to a patient? There is a neurosurgical intervention involved in using this therapy, and that sounds sort of scary, but the fact of the matter is it's pretty safe. But what exactly does the doctor in charge have to do?
Exactly, yeah. So this is kind of like a cardiac pacemaker. The technology is really based off of the original cardiac pacemaking concepts, but instead of putting the electrodes in the heart, the electrodes are placed in very specific locations in the brain, and each different disorder is uses a different part of the brain as its target. And what we have learned over the decades of use with this technology is that most of the diseases that we're trying to treat are what we will call brain circuit disorders. So in Parkinson's disease, there is a dysfunction in the motor circuit of the brain. In epilepsy, there is a dysfunction in the kind of hippocampal circuits, and we call the circuit of Papez. And epilepsy is usually gone awry. In obsessive compulsive disorder, there is a dysfunction in the prefrontal cortex and subcortical communication that we know has gone awry. And so these deep brain stimulation electrodes are put into very specific parts of the dysfunctional circuit to then stop this kind of abnormal or dysfunctional brain activity from happening. And so that happens by the neurosurgeon kind of putting in a permanent electrode into a very specific location in each person's brain, and then that electrode is subcutaneously connected to a pulse generator that's usually placed in the kind of in the chest of the patient. So everything is internal and everything is self-contained, and then that person lives with that device for many many years, and the device runs basically 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for years and years and years. So
How is it discovered which parts of the brain were dysfunctional in any given disease? I mean, that must have been quite a challenge to start with.
absolutely. Well, there you go. That's 100 years of basically human neuroscience, and most of the things that we actually know about human brain circuits really come from, let's call them, unfortunate accidents in neurology. So neurologists are wonderful observers of the world, and they have spent many of them have spent many years observing patients that have basically had strokes or lesions in different parts of the brain. You don't know this until after the fact, unfortunately, right? These are all retrospective studies on autopsy brains, but you figure out that a patient, when they were alive, had X and Y and Z symptoms. You then get their brain for study afterwards, and you find that they had a lesion or a stroke or a dysfunction in a certain part of the brain, and then you do this backwards calculation that this circuit or this part of the brain is associated with this specific circuit, and then when this person had a lesion in that part of the brain, they then had these symptoms and these features and these diseases, right? So this has taken many hundreds of years. This isn't like something that we just learned about. You build this up over many years, and you start to put together a puzzle that is, the human brain circuitry, and that's always augmented by these animal, kind of experiments. But animal brains are different than human brains, and that's why we still rely so much on, just old school, kind of neurology observation in many ways to, kind of better understand these brain circuits.
So tomorrow, if you had a patient with a specific diagnosis and you had a specific and anatomical target in the brain, what kind of imaging do you use to make the surgeon know where to go? And does the surgeon use imaging, or does he just know where to go?
Yeah, so great question. So yeah, we have many amazingly powerful tools in the 2020s that, neurologists in the 1920s didn't have, right? So nowadays we get these beautiful, kind of three-dimensional MRI data sets on every patient. And so you have this intimate knowledge of, the structure of each individual patient's brain, and you can use that imaging to visualize, many different, kind of features about their specific brain anatomy. And also there are ways that we can try and model what we would call their structural connectivity in their unique brain, and also their functional connectivity in their brain. And so nowadays we have these, really elaborate, we would, in the case of, let's say, deep brain stimulation, we would do a pretty extensive collection of what we call preoperative, brain imaging, to then be able to characterize, in their specific anatomy, exactly where the right place to stimulate would be to, target their specific, kind of brain circuit dysfunction.
You showed us some pictures back in May of these three-dimensional images, and they really are exactly what you described. They are almost science fiction, but except they're real. And I guess the thing that it sounds like at this point people wouldn't believe, but this is an FDA approved therapy. This is actually approved by the government for use. So why don't we start with that? Which of the target diseases that you listed a little bit ago are the ones that are the FDA has approved this for use?
Right. So the first one goes back to the kind of early 90s, I think, maybe, and that was essential tremor. So deep brain stimulation for the treatment of tremor is kind of the old original. The next one, and now what is the largest market, is deep brain stimulation for the treatment of Parkinson's disease. Then there is deep brain stimulation for the treatment of epilepsy. That's FDA approved. And then there is deep brain stimulation for the treatment of obsessive compulsive disorder. That's also FDA approved. And to my knowledge anyway, I think those are the ones that are, kind of like, those are established industry-based, products and FDA-approved therapies. And then there are many other things that are what we would call off-label. So people do research, clinical trials, trying to get to the point of FDA approval for many other things. So
Let's talk about Parkinson's for just a second. I assume that people who get deep brain stimulation for the treatment of Parkinson's disease have already gone through the routine sort of medical treatments that people get, like L-DOPA and all the other things. How successful is deep brain stimulation in Parkinson's disease in patients who have already failed other more conventional therapies?
yeah, it's really can be almost a miracle in some cases. So the sort of stated average that a patient should kind of expect to get is kind of a 50% improvement in their what we call the Unified Parkinson's Disease Rating Scale motor subsection. They should kind of expect to get approximately a 50% improvement in their Parkinson's symptoms from that scale.
And
From
which
DBS.
symptoms are most likely to respond to deep brain stimulation?
Yeah, so tremor is the easy one. Usually, if someone has tremor, that can usually be easily treated and is quite effective. The next most, kind of benefit that people get from DBS is the reduction in rigidity. So rigidity in their joints is actually, usually a really debilitating symptom. Unfortunately, one of the things that's actually the most troublesome to Parkinson's patients is what we call postural instability.
Yes.
And DBS is a little bit more variable on that. So usually you get good, really robust therapy and rigidity and really good, robust, response for tremor. But postural instability is a little bit more of a mystery. But yeah, those are things that, yeah.
What about the dementia associated with Parkinson's disease? Is that affected at all by deep brain stimulation?
So unfortunately, really we think about some of the side effects of deep brain stimulation can sometimes be, some of these what we consider neuropsychiatric side effects. Now, you also, as a normal part of Parkinson's disease,
Right.
people do have hallucinations and, kind of other, kind of neuropsych side effects, but then there can also be some, additional neuropsych disruption from DBS, but that's not common. That's just it is a known side effect. So
Now, two of the things that you presented to us in May that we found truly fascinating was the use of deep brain stimulation in depression, and the one that really knocked us off our feet was PTSD.
yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about those two?
Right. So deep brain stimulation for depression has been, kind of like the white whale of the field for many, many, many years. We have been trying to, crack that nut for at least a good 20 years now. And, there have been many ups and downs. So there have been a couple, what we would call pivotal clinical trials attempting to treat depression. And this is not, just vanilla depression. These are what we would call treatment-resistant depression patients. So these are patients that have failed, many, many, many other therapies before they get to being a candidate for deep brain stimulation. But they have no other options, and so then, we would love to be able to provide something to, to these people. But so there have been a couple what we call pivotal trials using different brain targets, different brain circuits, and those trials have generated in some patients, like once again, almost miracle responses. But unfortunately, there's been high variability in those trials. So some patients have no effect, whereas others have, effectively almost, miracle cures. And this has been then this conundrum for, like I said, more than 20 years now of people trying to figure out what is it that these patients that we know, they had an amazing effect. What's different about them in comparison to the patients that didn't have an effect? Is it that we didn't get the electrode in the right place? Is it that we didn't stimulate the circuit in the right way in terms of the stimulation parameter settings? Is it that we selected the wrong type of patient, right? They had a different phenotype of
Right.
depression that's just not what the therapy is actually capable of treating, right? And this has gone on forever, and we're still in the midst of that. And there's actually now a brand new, large-scale industry-sponsored trial starting, I think this year in 2025, run by a major device company to, kind of give depression one more chance in terms of deep brain stimulation therapy development. So
Well,
we'll wait and see on that one.
are there multiple targets in depression as opposed to example for Parkinson's
Yeah.
disease that make this a little bit more tricky to figure out what the right thing to do is?
Absolutely, right. So the Parkinson disease and the motor symptoms of Parkinson disease, like we know a lot more about the motor system, than we do about the, kind of cognitive system in the brain.
Right.
And or cause it, we call it the limbic system also. We know very little about how the prefrontal cortex and its circuitry really works. We know a lot about how the motor cortex works, and so we just have so many more well-defined scientific hypotheses about treating motor symptoms than we do about treating psychiatric symptoms. And that is one of the limitations that really is holding us back in terms of using deep brain stimulation technology to, treat these, more complicated diseases. So.
Yet you showed us in May tremendous success with PTSD, suggesting you know what the target is. I mean, you actually showed us tracings and how the deep brain stimulation interrupted the aberrant circuitry. Um, how did you figure that out with PTSD? And it sounds to me like this study is moving along pretty rapidly.
Yeah, and so that I don't want to take credit for that. This is really Nanthia Suthana's work, and she and I work very closely together. And she's a research superstar that has been focused on trying to develop deep brain stimulation therapies for PTSD. And in that case, you're right. There was a real scientifically driven hypothesis about where we want to put this electrode. And she has been able to leverage that circuitry-based hypothesis with devices that can also do intracranial neural recordings. And so they're with the idea that you could then use the neurophysiology to tell you when an episode of anxiety or, kind of trauma stress is going to trigger, so then you could stimulate that circuit to then quell that abnormal activity pattern and kind of stop the PTSD symptom in its tracks, right?
That really is a pacemaker, a brain pacemaker.
Exactly. So now we're moving into the world of what we would call closed loop deep brain stimulation. So now we're using an electrophysiological biomarker coming from the dysfunctional brain circuit to then trigger now a stimulation effect that's designed to stop or disrupt or break down that abnormal circuitry activity. And so super exciting stuff. Like I said, in small clinical trials so far, Nanthia and her team have had, really some amazing success. And, and it's kind of, that is what people think about as kind of like the next generation of this kind of technology that's using these biomarkers of neuroactivity to then communicate with the brain, as opposed to kind of maybe a sledgehammer approach, if you will, of old school deep brain stimulation, where you're just like pounding the circuit continuously to shut it down. So.
When a doctor is communicating with the brain, Is he communicating with the person in whose brain, in which the brain sits? Because one of the things we've sort of talked about is neural augmentation. Can you use deep brain stimulation to actually make the brain function better? And if you are making the brain functioning better, what's the ethics of that? And what does that mean for humans?
Yeah, okay, well, that is some really interesting stuff. And
Well, I mean,
you can
that's what
go
the
down a rabbit
podcast is
hole with
about.
that one. But it is, that is, I have little doubt that, in my lifetime, we will get to the point where we have learned enough about brain activity patterns to be able to, kind of, as you said, augment the kind of speed of mental processing in a given patient. And now there's a whole other cans of worms about kind of making that happen and how many electrodes someone would have to subject themselves to, and all kinds of computational processing challenges that would have to be overcome, and many caveats on this.
Not to
But
mention the informed consent.
oh, exactly. Like, so this, this is not has not been a challenge in our field previously because one, we don't have the ways of, kind of what I would consider bidirectional communication with the device and a given patient's brain to even be able to. This was never a worry. This is never something that we would, consider as a threat or a risk or a concern because the devices just simply are not technologically capable of doing such a thing. But there has been a parallel field of deep brain stimulation for the last, once again, 20, 30 years called brain machine interfacing. And that field has, spent much of their time actually building what we would call the decoding algorithms, right? So they are recording in their world, they would implant many electrodes in the brain and then record and use those streams of neural activity to train decoders that then can interpret that brain activity to then make predictions about where a person might want to move their arm, for example, or words that they might want to say if they were kind of a locked in patient or a patient with ALS. They could be a speech decoder or a patient with a major spinal cord injury. They could be a movement, move a robot arm based on their thoughts, right? So this is the world of what we would call brain machine interfacing. So it's taken a long road, but that brain machine interfacing world, and now is something that has a huge amount of Wall Street money investment going into it.
That's Neuralink, isn't it?
That would be exactly. So Neuralink would be the most famous of these kinds of companies. So they are finally getting to the point where those kinds of technologies and those kinds of, kind of thought process are probably on the verge of starting to be able to do something that might be clinically relevant. But in my opinion, they're not really there yet. But you can see the evolution of the technology coming. And you can see the game plan, if you will, of kind of the that business, right? That yes, their goal right now is to beta test this technology in very small patient populations like ALS or spinal cord injury, but that would to make those devices work, you're talking about many millions of dollars per patient, and it's not really tenable. But if you start to figure out how to make that work on a scale that could be scaled up to people who might be, normal, able-bodied humans with huge bank accounts that do want to spend that kind of money to quote unquote augment their brain, well, that's a different calculation that is an interesting conundrum for the future. Is that something that society would accept? And is that something that there would be people that would be willing to sign up and do it?
Well,
And so, yeah.
it's the question of the brain-mind continuum. Where is a thought in the brain? And There is the obvious question that at some point, I suspect any brain researcher comes across, which is where's free will? What
Yes.
what is really our decision? What are we deciding? And what is the brain deciding for us? And I mean, the field of optogenetics is another one where this sort of thing is going on, where there are these mechanical and electrical connections to the circuits of the brain that somehow lead to behaviors. Now, who decides? And I guess in an animal, you wonder. I mean, and then eventually it'll get to us, I suspect, but I'm not sure I'll live to see that at my age, but you might. Andrew certainly will. At this point, I usually ask Andrew if he has any comments as a layperson about what all he just heard.
Yeah, so thanks, Doc, for joining. I have one of the diseases that you talked about um, with OCD. So I obviously I've been on medication for quite a bit. It's been diagnosed. Will My first question is am I a qualified person, clinical trial person to be considered for one of the deep brain stimulation implants?
Uh, I'm just a PhD man, so like you don't want to take any medical advice from me. All right, so that's step number one. Step number two is, it really is something that like you'd have to know a lot, or psychiatrists have to know a lot more about your specific situation to be able to kind of characterize you for that. But in general, people that once again are candidates for these things, they're usually ones that really they're not well managed with medication. They're not well managed with kind of traditional psychiatric treatment strategies, right? And so these kinds of technologies, and that's why this has never really been an issue with this augmentation thing that that we talked about before, is that they're last resort technologies, and this kind of paradigm shift is, what if these neurotechnologies actually become not last resort things, but more, midline or, even frontline based technologies, then that's a very different, sort of situation with, kind of, like you said, the value of it relative to the I don't know, ethical, kind of calculus. So
And
You guys are going to have to go through what we in oncology had to do at one point, is to really look hard at the ethics of what you're doing. I think as you progress and actually can really make a greater difference. Uh, One of the things that, for example, as a 50-year oncologist, is when I started, the drugs we had to use were fairly primitive. Now, the drugs are targeted, sophisticated, and often immune based. So the decisions and the quandaries and the ethics for each individual patient and each individual trial have gotten far more complex. My guess is you're on your way.
absolutely, and we have been aware of it's not as if this is a revelation that just came up today.
No.
Like so this conundrum, if you will, of this transition in kind of the use case options for the neurotechnology. Is people have been really aware of this issue brewing for, let's say, at least the last decade. And for example, the NIH Brain Initiative has an entire division that is kind of dedicated to investigating the kind of ethical implications of these neurotechnology devices. And so so there are legit scientists, on the neurotech side, working hand in hand with legit, neuroethicists, trying to kind of like prepare, if you will, for this, kind of potential transition that might happen with the use of these devices. And it makes for obviously interesting conversation no matter what. But it's also, kind of, as you watch, I'm a science fiction, television and movie fan. I love this stuff. You know what I mean? Like you think what we can do right now is almost infantile compared to what will likely be possible in terms of, the technology that we have access to 50 years from now or 100 years from now or, goodness gracious, 1,000 years from now, if human beings are still alive 1,000 years from now. Anyway, a sidebar, but, this concept of think about the pace of, technological innovation in these medical devices over a 30-year span. And then, that's a accelerating ramp, that's now seeing more investment in 2025 than it probably has ever seen. Right. So with money and investment comes additional acceleration. That's just normal. So
I think that it's likely that maybe someday, Andrew, you will be a candidate for a clinical trial like this, but I can assure you as your father and as the physician on this call, you're not quite ready for that yet. Because I've seen the pictures that Dr. McIntyre shown, and you're not quite ready for that. And I do agree. I think that when we can talk to the brain, or more importantly, when machines can talk to the brain, and the brain can run a machine without turning any knobs, I think that we are in a very different place than we are right now, and working out the ethics of exactly what we can do, and then what we should do. Using that, as always in science, whether that's atomic energy or anything else, what should we do, not what can we do?
yes.
I'm glad you are there and making some of those decisions. And I am thrilled with you getting on the podcast with us. We were so excited to hear you talk in May. It was great. And it's been a wonderful experience today.
Thank you so much for joining A New Prescription. We're so excited that you stopped by. Please join us on our social pages at A New Prescription, and also subscribe to our YouTube channel at A New Prescription YouTube. Remember, your health is the most important thing to you. We'll see you next time.